All eyes today are going to be on the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, as he delivers the medium-term budget policy statement. We've already told you, of course, the union, SATU, the South African Democratic Teachers Union, are going to be protesting outside as part of COSATU. In fact, the wider federation are going to be protesting around budget cuts. This is, of course, as we've got runaway debt. It's going to be a delicate balancing act for Enoch Godongwana. And just to take us through expectations and how things could go, we've invited Investec Chief Economist Annabel to join us this morning to explain the rands and cents of it all. Always a pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you for your time.
Yes, hi, thanks very much.
There's been a lot of excitement around the GNU, certainly from business and the markets, but the lived experience of ordinary citizens suggests that not everybody has felt that sense of optimism in the real economy.
Hi, yes, so I think, we're in early stages of the new government, and I think everyone's looking forward today to the medium-term budget policy statement to see what it's going to hold, the first one of the new government of national unity, as you say. Of course, we are obviously coming from an environment of high interest rates, high inflation and weak economic growth. But looking forward, the expectation is that the government of national unity will deliver faster economic growth, lower inflation. Of course, we've already seen inflation drop below 4%. And further interest rate cuts, of course, already seen the first interest rate cut in September as well.
Annabel, there's a delicious piece by Jabulani Sikhakhane in the Business Day today. He's focusing specifically on the question of leadership and what the president needs to do, but I suspect it does cascade down to the ministers and other levels of government. And essentially the point he's making there is it's one thing to conduct a choir. It's an entirely different thing to herd cats. We've got these competing interests in the GNU, in the alliance. Debt is an issue. Spending cuts are an issue. How to balance it all?
Yes, I think, you're completely right. And, the flavor of today very much is the budget and, of course, spending and revenue. Look, I think, when you talk about balancing, in terms of the budget, that's exactly right. You're looking at balancing the resources you have, the revenue that comes in, obviously with the vast expenditure needs we see in South Africa, and of course the difference, the deficit is, really what is being looked at today. That is often covered by borrowings. I think, some good news for us to look at, it's important to look at good news as well, is that we have actually seen some improvement in the figures that have come in so far this year from a government revenue perspective. And that really talks to the fact that revenue itself has now increased to about 42% of what is budgeted for the year. And of course, last year, we were only sitting at about 37%. So that difference really talks to the fact that last year we had the drop in commodity prices. And of course, we also found ourselves in a situation as well where the freight crisis was very severe. We're talking about congestion at the ports in South Africa, congestion on the rail system. Now, we have recently seen statistics showing that rail freight has improved in South Africa. That came through from Statistics South Africa, so that's a positive. So really, where we're sitting this year is that budget shows that revenue is at 42% and expenditure at 43%. So that means a smaller deficit, if you will, a difference between the two. And of course, if you look at last year, as I said, revenue was only at 37%, while expenditure was at 43%. So, if you have a smaller deficit, that should put less pressure on government borrowings and, of course, as well, make the environment a bit easier. Also reduce pressure when we start to look at credit ratings.
Yeah, but we've had some difficult problems to contend with, as you point out, both from the logistics situation and general infrastructure around the country and the impact. But of course, we also can't ignore that we've got, 28 million people on some type of social grant compared to the just about 7.5 million people who actually pay personal income tax.
And of course, this is the real rub in South Africa. We need to keep the revenues up to pay for the vast majority of people who, as you mentioned, are sitting on social welfare services. And of course, the key issue, and if we look at some surveys that have been done, many of those individuals say they'd rather not be receiving social welfare. They'd rather obviously be in employment and receiving a decent salary and wage, well above what obviously is given from social welfare. And of course, that's really where economic growth comes in as well, where economic growth is so very important. And of course, that's another area that will be looked at in terms of the budget today, what allocations are being made from an expenditure perspective, both to stimulate economic growth and also, to provide infrastructure, government expenditure, that in turn supports economic growth, but of course also provides services to people in South Africa, whether it's education, healthcare, and of course also, looks at roads, infrastructure, all of those areas. The parastatals, the SOEs are included as well. So, we obviously have seen some bailouts happen in the past to Eskom and to Transnet. But of course, we've also seen over the past few years the business-government partnership working hard together to really reduce the crisis introduced last year at Eskom and Transnet. So, this new partnership, as I said, introduced last year, has really started to make good inroads in reducing these blockages, if you will, in the economy. And that is expected to be one of the key drivers to lift economic growth over the medium term. We think it could move out to 3 to 5%. And of course, that will have an impact on employment.
And those would be significant improvements, would they not? But there's still an expectation for business as usual, if you will. Earlier, I said that SATU is going to be protesting outside as the minister gives that speech, along with COSATU, the federation. There's still a demand from public sector trade unions for a 12% wage increase for more than 1.3 million employees. Is that reasonable?
So I think, this is where we find the difficulty. Government is targeting an inflation rate of 4%. So that's really where you see the discrepancy. Coming in at 12%, government obviously targeting, an inflation rate of 4.5%. But looking to, as we've heard, communications from the Reserve Bank, targeting maybe 4% or lower. But nevertheless, 12% is very well above, where the inflation range was, 3 to 6%, and of course the target of 4.5%. Interestingly, we've had a lot of communication come through from the Reserve Bank talking about lowering the target towards that of our key trading partners. And of course, if you look at those, they are the United States, China, as you know, and of course Europe, the UK. Their inflation target sits at about 2%. Now, if we can lower our inflation target significantly and therefore our inflation rate to 2% in South Africa, that would result in a much more stable rand and of course also result in lower fuel prices in South Africa, as well as lower pressure on inflation in general. So, of course, this is where the as we said, discrepancy or the rub comes, demanding wages at 12% or more when inflation in South Africa is currently running below 4%, obviously would put upward pressure on inflation instead of helping to bring it down. But on the other hand, of course, individuals facing higher living costs and, of course, unions as well looking to garner, increases from obviously payments that workers make to the unions. All of those factors come into this equation now. So, of course, you do have individuals and, of course, unionized groups of people looking to obviously push constantly for this higher wages. Yeah. And, of course, our previous Reserve Bank Governor and Labour Minister, Tito Mboweni, he obviously spoke about it extremely well, saying, he sat on both sides of the situation. And, of course, it's very difficult to get inflation down in an environment where you obviously see this upward wage pressure. So there's a debate to be had on each side.
Is there low-hanging fruit, even symbolic gestures, if you will? For example, we've seen criticism for spending on areas such as VIP protection. For example, there have been calls for beefing up the prosecuting system, the criminal justice system as a whole, the NPA, SAPS, the Special Investigating Unit, SARS. And the idea, of course, is if those were solidified, we'd see even more revenue collection. We would obviously decrease unnecessary spending and corruption.
So I think that's very important, white-collar crime and, of course, beefing up the collection ability of SARS, really broadening and widening and improving the big business unit there to collect a lot of crime. We're talking about white-collar crime here, but you also talk about monies flowing overseas, very large amounts. I mean, that's absolutely necessary for our country to plug the gap from a revenue expenditure perspective, but also, of course, as well, if you get off the grey list, if you look at the business-government partnership we've talked about earlier, there are three core areas, electricity and freight, Transnet and Eskom have already talked through, but of course also as well crime and corruption. And of course, money laundering and all the aspects that will put us on the grey list are absolutely vital to improve the functioning of our country. And of course, by removing all of those factors that got us on the grey list would both strengthen South Africa, but of course, as you said, aid very substantially in getting us more money into the pot. So we do need to plug those gaps, and we expect there'll be a lot more talked about today. You talk about low-hanging fruit as well. I think the financial markets would react very well to a drop in the inflation target. There's certainly expected to be communication on that today, if not the actual event of the drop in the target. And of course, from that perspective, that could see rand strength and of course reduce bond yields. We haven't talked about that, but bond yields in South Africa, the cost of borrowing for the government, they have been very high before the election. They were above 12%. They've now come down to around 10%. And of course, if we see a reduction in the borrowing requirement going forwards, and of course a lower cost of longer term borrowing, therefore, that would help improve the fundamentals of the economy, shore up our credit ratings as well, prevent us from getting lower credit ratings and help us obviously getting higher ratings, but also of course as well just improve investor sentiment towards South Africa. And every time the rand strengthens, we see we could be in line for a petrol price cut if we don't see high oil price internationally. So these are all very, very important factors for South African citizens today. We don't expect any changes in tax rates. That's typically done in the February budget.
Yeah.
But the MTDPS has often in the past been a time when there's been talk around the inflation target.
Cautious optimism, I think, is the sentiment for most economists. We're certainly a lot happier than we might have been this time a year ago. Annabel Bishop, appreciate your time. She's the chief economist at Investec.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.